What are you using on your mix bus?
It's very often, it depends on the source, but it very, very often ends up being an Unfairchild. It's very versatile. I love the MS processing that it does on a mix bus. It was something I was sort of wary of for a long time. It's like, do I really want it, compressing just mono information different than the stereo information? That seems weird to me. The stereo image is going to be sort of fluctuating and stuff. When you put it on there, it sounds amazing. It's really a cool effect. And so I've grown pretty attached to that. Anything that really wants to have this big open presentation to it, that MS thing on the Unfairchild is really incredible. I love that. I have some EQs that I really love. There's these old passive Langevin program EQs. So it's just lows and highs. There's only 2 faders on it. And the selection is 3K, 5K, 10K, 15K. And I would say like the 5K and the 10K are just pure magic on these things. I don't know what's going on or why they sound the way they do, but you can put like 2 maybe 4 dB of this on a mix, and it's just like this amazing, beautiful energy that gets added to the mix, and it's not even the tiniest bit harsh. It's just beautiful sounding. So a lot of times those will go on there. Then there's a whole digital side to it as well. Like, my whole mix bus, because of my passive summing mixer, the final thing, the whole thing, by the time the music and the vocals, everything sums together, it goes through these summing bus amplifiers from this old RCA tube console. And so I've been doing that for the last 2 or 3 years. 2.5 years, something like that. That's also amazingly beautiful sounding. Just glues everything together, and it just sounds like what I want music to sound like. It's pretty heavy-handed. There's a good amount of distortion in there, but, I'd rather do it with an old RCA tube, bus preamplifier than end up adding distortion in the mastering with a limiter, It just sounds more musical to me. So that's on there. I use C4 sometimes just to add more compression in the low end. I like the Little Labs VOG plugin, the Voice of God plugin, to thicken up the low end. That thing is very unique. The character of the low end that it adds is really cool. Sometimes I'll do that. And then, okay, let me see if I can remember the name of it.
I've never tried the VOG one on the mix bus. Yeah,
I highly recommend
will do that.
it.
Yeah, we'll do that.
Yeah,
definitely.
It's super fun. It's this thing called Gullfoss. Have you played with that?
Yeah, I use that on my mix bus too. Just at the end of the mix, just like 3 to 4%. I love that.
Yeah, that thing is black magic, man. I don't know what they're doing there, but
have you tried
incredible.
that? I think they came out with a new distortion plugin.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And since you like distortion, you should try it.
Yeah. I definitely want to hear what they have to say about distortion. Those guys are on another level.
I need to try that too.
But the Gullfoss thing, I learned I have to be careful with that. And I think I'm similar to you, where I don't put that on early in the process because it just, it would influence heavily. And at the end of the day, like, I still have moments where I get to the end of the process, I'll try putting Gullfoss on there, and it's like, this doesn't need that. And that's when I feel like, okay, I still know how to mix. If I don't have to put that thing on there, it's amazing what it does. It's just all of a sudden your mix is just clearer and just sounds, it's just easier to listen to, But there, if the mix truly doesn't need it, that will reveal itself as well, But yeah, that thing is amazing. I used it heavily on the Grace Potter Mother Road record, because that record was mixed under somewhat challenging circumstances, with a very temporary, somewhat unreliable, monitoring setup. Yeah, boy, if anybody could have seen that, it was like, oh my God, how is this supposed to work? But we got it done. And that plugin helped a lot at the end of the process because I just couldn't hear clear enough to really be able to place things properly. And it did an amazing job of untangling things on some of those mixes.
Yeah. Well, most of my mixes are through a summing network and analog stereo bus. So I have a Burl summing system set up, 32 channel summing box that all my Pro Tools outputs come through. And then that goes through a analog mix bus chain. And that mix bus changes depending on the song, depending on the music. I use a Chandler curve bender EQ that I've used for years, especially for rock music. It's really, really great. I use the Shadow Hills mastering compressor in hardware. And when I've done stuff in software only, I'll use some of those similar devices. Sometimes for more rock music, the Allen Smart C2, the SSL style compressor, is great because it manages the mid-range in a really nice way. So I'll use that for more rock things. Sometimes if I need a touch of EQ on the back end, I'll use an API 550 to get a little bit more 15K or something on the mix. I have an SSL Fusion here, which I use often on the mix, but the only thing I really use from it is a little bit of saturation and a little bit of MS widening. I don't use the EQ or the high frequency limiter or some of the other things that it'll do. So I keep it pretty simple. And, part of the thing is that I've got to use devices, since those are in the analog world, I've got to use devices that have click stops, detents on the pots, so I can recall the mixes. So when it comes to doing a mix, I've got to keep my stereo bus, as consistent as possible. And I take pictures of every song, and then I've got to, click stop, put everything back for the next song. So I'm always taking clear photographs and recalling things old school. But doing stuff in the box, I guess I am using very similar kind of techniques.
What do you use on your mix bus?
API 2500 and a MOG MA4 EQ4M.
And when you start a mix, do you start with the compression on, or how do you do it?
I record with the compressor on. I mix with the compressor on. Yeah.
Always.
Always.
I have several mix buses. I have found over the years, because of the need for stems and all kinds of things, the best and most effective use of my time is to have like staged mix buses. My first main mix bus is 5 buses, which are called VB, which is vocal bus, DB, which is a drum bus. What's the next one? BB, which is the band bus, OB, which is the orchestra bus, and then MB, which is the effects bus. So those then are delivered to the stereo mix bus, or in the case of 714, the 714 mix bus. From there, the stereo version and the 714 version diverge quite a bit. The stereo version of the mix bus goes through a process that I've developed over the years based on Blumline stereo work back in the 30s. Blumline came up with apart from being a terribly brilliant man and developing all these concepts, he talks about stereo, and he says, the one thing about stereo is the phantom center is very inaccurate, especially at higher frequencies. And he said the main reason for that is the lower frequencies, when they come to the left and the right ear, they're relatively identical in time. But when you get to the higher frequencies, because the wavelengths are so long, but at around 800 hertz or so, the wavelength equals the distance between the two ears. Mm-hmm. And now the wavelength is getting shorter and shorter. So even though the bass signal may arrive here pretty simultaneously from the left and the right for the phantom center, when you get to 10K, what arrives here and what arrives here can be 5, 6, 10, 20 samples off. So suddenly they don't integrate as well. So your phantom center starts becoming smeared at the top. Mm-hmm. So I go through a process in stereo where I break the frequencies up into 4 bandwidths, and from 800 hertz to 10K, I start narrowing the stereo image, so that by about 12K or so, I'm about 30% in from what I am at the lower frequencies. It may be bullshit. It may be my just hearing what I want to hear. But every time I try to eliminate that process and go direct, that powerful center goes away. So I just use it. That's it. It's part of what I do. It's one of the few things that I do. Anything stereo gets that treatment. And then in the mix bus itself, I'll start out with some type of, I'll just listen to the mix. And if I think it needs a little EQ, I'll start with an equalizer. Usually I go to an EQP Pultec or a Neve 1073 and, or an API. Most of these are UAD emulations. And so I love them. They're so fantastic. So even though I'm mixing in digital, I'm using some analog processing. Not processing, analog emulation. Okay. Then after the equalizer, I'll probably add a compressor. I may not use it, or I may compress so slightly that you hardly notice, or I may slam it. It all depends as I'm working on the mix, what I want to do. That almost invariably is the George Massenburg multi-band DRC3. I got to say, the most incredible compressor on the planet, and not just that George is my friend. I get no money for this. But anybody that doesn't have it is losing out on one of the best, not compressors ever made, so much as one of the best tools. For shaping a mix, I can't go into it enough. It's very confusing, as George's shit always is. He's one of those Musk characters, who just think differently than the rest of us, and they're getting information from the ionosphere or something, and sometimes it almost always translates into something brilliant, but sometimes translates into something a little difficult to intuit. But incredible compressor. Got a lot of knobs. You can just tune, you can make it sound analog, digital, whatever you want. It's just phenomenal. So that will be my compressor. And then I may take the EQ that I added before the compressor and duplicate it after the compressor, and then compare, do I like it before? Do I like it after? It will sound different. So basically, that's my mix bus. Now, in stereo, I go to a second mix bus where I do more compression and more equalization, which is, so that will be called the mix bus, whatever the mix number is, M25. Then that goes to XM25. And on that bus is a device I love so much is the Abbey Road TGM box.
Mm-hmm.
And it's got compression, it's got EQ, and it's got compressor EQ, and then, side chains. Anyway, it's a phenomenal box. And it's one of the most analog sounding digital tools I've found. I'll put that on the mix bus, the secondary mix bus. And again, because that has an equalizer and compressor, that's generally all I need. If I need to still tap some peaks, then I'll add a brick wall limiter just for, tapping down the peaks. And generally I use the Waves L3. So the reason for the two buses is I have found that although I'm mainly mixing from the main mix, I'm constantly want to hear it in a more mastered situation. I may be mixing at -18 for the stereo mix, but I want a -11 or -12 for what I send to the artist. So I print these both simultaneously and go through the secondary phase where I increase the volume and may do a slight. It's like a mastering. Mm-hmm. So, but those are printed simultaneously. So when I finish, I have a mix M and a mix XM.
Well, I'm a proponent in that you probably don't need much lifting on the mix bus to begin with, because I think there's always a better blend or a better leveling that can solve most of the problems that you're trying to solve on the mix bus. So I approach it in two ways. One, the entire mix bus has to be there at the beginning, and I mix into clipper and limiter because it immediately affects the size of the record. There are people who say, well, you shouldn't do that and let mastering do that, blah, 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 blah. But to me, over the years, the record changes too much when you do that, when it comes back. So limiters most of the time make your sounds a little smaller. Like they make the level louder, but the sound actually a little smaller. So I want to be able to push into the limiter and go like, okay, this sounds good. Or now it's pushing against my kick drum or whatever too much. So now the kick drum becomes smaller again, but now I have to push the kick drum. I now still have the opportunity to push the kick differently, or maybe add a little bit more bottom or what have you, to counteract what the limiter just did. But if I never heard that, then basically I'm setting myself up for, well, it's gonna change in mastering, and you're most likely not gonna not gonna like it. So that's the one thing. The other thought is like the plugins I use are plugins that have very good quality, but that are used in the final steps like mastering as well. There used to be a time when literally the mastering engineer had the best gear that you couldn't have or afford. And so there was actually a real point of going, well, I probably shouldn't touch my record too much because they can do it better. And skill aside, of course, they're all very skilled at what they're doing. But I'm also very skilled. I also master when it's necessary. So I'm not afraid of that. But now that we're basically using the same tools in many cases, I'm like, well, why shouldn't I be able to use my limiter? There's nothing wrong with it, you know. I have ears. I have considerable experience, and it doesn't mean I'm not knocking mastering engineers. They're beautiful to have around. I'm just saying they shouldn't stop me, so to speak. So I'm pushing into this layer of dynamic compaction with the limiters that I need to hear, where I clearly can say, okay, that's too much. This record cannot be this loud. Well, I mean, it can, but it clearly is suffering because we're pushing it too loud. I shouldn't be surprised by that at the very end of the process in mastering. So it's mostly that. There's a tiny bit of spreading going on, like just like stereo spreading. That would come from ozone most of the time, and And I might have an EQ over there that gives me a little bit of a smiley curve, and that might be different ones. It might be, what do I use? The Chandler, the curve bender is a good one, but also the BX Digital, which is a very straight ahead one. I have used the Mac DSP filter bank for this, and if I need another band, I might just use the Fab Filter Q3, which is currently just like what everybody uses. That was not always the case, but it is a very, very good EQ. Can't wait to check out Q4, which just came out. So just if I had to describe the mix bus, it's like first level, I might have a trim plugin, and because I might be too soft or too loud, I might just push it a little bit. I'd use compression very little. I mean, I do like the Townhouse compressor that Plugin Alliance makes.
Yeah,
they're great. But I use it so little. I mean, you were talking like a dB, and then on top of that, I only use it in parallel. You know, wow. I really feel that unless the actual genre calls for it, for instance, rock mixes are more compressed normally, I don't use much compression on the master bus. But when I use it, it's there from the beginning. So basically the sound gets baked in. And again, if it's too much, I can already see it. There will be a little bit of multi-band compression, but not the way we see it portrayed on the internet a lot, which is like a dancing multi-band compression on all bands. I personally don't like that because it feels it's not like it's cheating, which is a little bit of cheating, but I don't care. You can cheat if that makes you faster. Just cheat. I don't care. Just make a better record. Congratulations, you saved yourself some time. No, but because I don't like this idea that like my mix bus, similar to what I was talking about the monitoring beforehand, if the mix bus should mostly be white and plain and untouched. If it's already like a thing that bumps and goes up and down and pushes at different frequencies, I'm like, how am I supposed to control that in any shape or form? I'm just like, then I'm just guessing that that hoping that the multiband compressor or EQ, sorry, is just taking care of my problems. That's very hard for me to understand in my mind. I'm just like, what am I actually doing here? So the multiband compression that I do mostly is just in the bass. And it's really with a very specific task. And the task is that in most genres, in most records, short of maybe jazz, maybe, we want a solid bass line. That's why it's there. The player played it as even as they could. All the tonics are as even as they could be played. If they're not, then there's an issue with the playing, right? Bass players, give me a call. We'll talk about that if I'm right. But it feels like the function is that we have a bottom that solidifies the record. So that's why I have a multiband compression on the master for only the bass, because basically it gives me like another 1 dB or 1.5 dB of evening the bass out, because now the bass and the kick could hit together or not together, like things that affect each other, where the solidness of the bass gets out of whack, and so the multi-band compression pushes against that a little bit. But like everything above 300 or so might be totally even. So even though it might be like a 4-band dynamic compressor, multi-band compressor, the upper 3-band might not do anything. You know, they're also not a curve, because I see that sometimes people have. There are some, I'm not going to call it out, but like there are some presets I see all the time where like the multi-band output curve looks like this. Like the higher you go, like +5, +6 dB, and I'm like, no. I mean, good for you, but I don't want that at all. Like, it should be actually flat. It should be unity gain per band in my book. And obviously I'm wrong, because other people do it differently. But that's how I feel about this. And then EQ last, and then limiter very last. But that's basically my my master bus. I mix really loud. Again, depending on genre, I'm definitely at -9 and -8. by the end of the mix before we're even mastering. And I do print 2 versions, but I do like one with less level, but I don't take stuff off. I push a little less into it, kind of going like, well, the circuitry of these processors is still in the mix, which means whatever they did to the song, short of the actual gain reduction, is still on the lower level version of this mix. And I sent both of them, and I kid you not, like to mastering, I kid you not, about half of the time they used my lower level and half they used my higher level. And I tell them, like, I send you that at full quality because I want you, mastering engineer, to choose what you think is the best version of the song that makes you help make a better master. But if I only gave you the lower level and then maybe the MP3 of the higher level, I'm like, no, I'm just taking information and sources away from you. I feel actually that's a really wrong approach. There's nothing wrong with the loud one. Very often this was what happens to me. I master with somebody. They master 12 songs, get paid for 12 songs, of course. And they show me their creative input of what they would do with the thing. And then it comes back to me, like I listen to it, and me and the client, it's not me pushing for it, but we will just go like, okay, well, these 6 songs, the mastering engineer did something that's beautiful and awesome. And these other 6, your pre-master, whatever, my final mix was just better. So we'll just keep that. And I tell them all, that's not a waste of time or money. This is exactly what you need. This is a creative exploration. And you like this one and you didn't like that one. It doesn't mean the mastering engineer didn't nail it. It was just like this, look, we like this one. And you're lucky. My mix is so loud and proud and finished that you can just put it out like that. That's fine. Or, and this happens from time to time, it's like they basically, well, we like this. Can you just do the mastering for these other songs? Or like, well, can you now do the mastering for the songs that you actually mixed? And mixing is a single effort. Like I want to optimize the song, right? Mastering, if it's an album or an EP, is a effort where we're putting these songs into a sequence and how they live together. So of course I want to make a small adjustment to make them flow better, maybe together. But it's not because a step was missing or the song didn't sound good. It's just because now they're in a different context. So sometimes I get hired to do that. So I am a mastering engineer officially, and I do master stuff. But my main gig is being a mixer.
So for the multiply and compressor, are you using the ozone too?
Yes, actually, the ozone is the only thing that does a little bit of the spreading and the multiband compression, but it doesn't. I don't use the limiter on it, though it does sound really good. I just in my workflow, I used to use it more, and I was really happy with it, but now I don't use it anymore. And I don't use EQ in that. I use only the multiband and the spreader in that. I should probably use the harmonic exciter because then all my records would be hit records. I know, but I'm not.
And what are you using for the clipper and the limiting?
That changes, but I do like K-clip. I do like Gold clip. Those two actually are the most used ones. Gold clip, shout out Ryan Schwab, really good guy, really good mastering engineer too. And for the limiting that's at the very end, I like a few, and it's odd. I think my number one go-to would be the Stealth limiter by IK Multimedia, which is great. And I do like a very old Pro Tools limiter called the Massey L2007, I think.
Yeah,
and I know that's not available for all DAWs, but it's a great one. There are some moments when the Stealth. So what I like about the Stealth limiter, it's really punchy. Like it does retain transients surprisingly well, like excellently. And every now and then it does this thing where like the whole song is great, but then in the second verse there's this one thing that hits it and it actually distorts. And you're like, but wait a second, in my chorus that's louder it seems to not be distorting, or maybe you don't hear it because there's more stuff going on. I don't know. So when that happens, I go to the 2007 because I get it's a tiny compromise because you get a tiny bit less of the attack, and a tiny bit, but it's a tiny bit cleaner. It's like that. I have automated limiters on songs before. Where like I was really happy with the whole thing, and then there were like 2 places where I'm like, why is this crapping out over here? And I just automated on the master into a different limiter for that moment, and it works. In the end, that's what you do. There's a really cool story, which I don't know the full truth of, just the outcome, so to speak. You remember that song "Black or White" by Michael Jackson, right? Yeah. That was mixed on 2 different consoles and then spliced together. The super nerdy answer would be, we chose the consoles for the verses and the whatever. What I actually think happened is that they somehow liked the one mix better for other reasons. It just happened to be on a different board, and then they spliced it together, which is a cool solution to the problem. But that's where I kind of got the idea. I was like, why do I need to only use one limiter if it doesn't work for the whole song? Sure. And that's what I did.
These days, I am using 2550 API stereo bus compressor, and I'm going into Tube EQ, the A Designs hammer, and then I come into Pro Tools. I'm also using like the Lindell transformer, and I've got, like, just for reference, the adapter AB. But keeping it pretty simple.
Usually I will start with a black box HG2 saturator. A little bit of squeeze sometimes. Sometimes that's a little bit too aggressive, but most of the time it's really nice at just kind of giving you a starting place. And then UAD Manley Varimu. If I have a lot of stems and stuff to print, I won't use my real Varimu. I have a real Manley, which sounds amazing. The plugin sounds the same to my ears. So it's HG2 Manley Varimu. Usually the Pultec Pro Legacy with the EQP1A and MEQ5. And then often something to just give it a little bit more squeeze, like a BX Master Desk I'll use a lot. And then I'll usually finish off with something like a Gold Clip from Schwab Digital or FabFilter Pro L2, something like that. The oversampling on the Pro L2 sounds great, so I tend to keep that last in the chain and just right before I print, bump it up to 32 times oversampling and let it print.
I've got a couple kind of different hardware chains. I've got one hardware chain. I'm just looking at it. That's why I'm looking away from the monitor right now. I've got an SSL Bus Plus and an SSL Fusion, which is kind of like their mixed bus processors right now. I love them both. The Bus Plus obviously is like almost overwhelmingly flexible. Like there's so many options on that thing. That sometimes I find it overwhelming, but sometimes it gives me, especially if I'm having problems on a mix where, I've tried to do as much as I can without even Mixbus doing too much, and I'm just like, something's not working. Sometimes I'll spend a half hour just experimenting with the Bus Plus, and sometimes I find that magic setting that just kind of helps alleviate some of those problems I was having. And then the other chain that I have is Obsidian, Dramatic Audio Obsidian compressor, which is kind of like an SSL G-Comp style compressor. The Dangerous Audio Bax EQ, and then the Overstayer MAS, which is like a saturator. But one of the things, I was actually talking about this recently to a friend of mine. We were talking about the Overstayer. We were kind of talking about what I really like about it, and although I do like the saturation of it. I think one of the things I realized when we started talking about it, I went and looked back at some recall sheets. I really love the EQ. Like it's got buttons for these shelf EQs and also a high pass filter. I love the sound of those. I don't think I've ever done a mix where I've used that where they haven't been in. So whatever those are doing, like just gives me a curve that just, again, it's kind of like, that's my flavor of ice cream that I like to eat. It's just like, it does everything I want it to do. So as much as obviously I am saturating a little bit using that unit, I think even if I wasn't doing any saturation, just like the EQ on you can't change them. It is what they are. And there's a high shelf, a low shelf, and a high pass. And so I use those a lot. And then I've got plugins in the box that I use as well. Like I said, I use that SPL Vitalizer I really like on the mix bus for a variety of things. Back in the day when I worked at the chop shop, we had a Sontec 432 EQ that we used all the time. And so I've always had some sort of kind of plug-in version of trying to replicate that. The latest one from Make Believe Audio is awesome, or Make Believe Studios, I guess, is great. So I've been using that a ton. And then I usually have some sort of limiter. I like the Ozone limiter. I like the old Massey L2007 limiter. I use that a lot as well. So just something to kind of to pull up the level when I'm sending mixes out. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll get so used to the sound. Like if I'm doing a mix, well, let's say where it goes through quite a few revisions, and so I'm sending out a lot of mixes with the limiter on. I'll get used to that, and it will become kind of part of the sound. Where when it's like time to send to the mastering guy, instead of taking it off, I'll leave it on and just lower the output. So some sort of limiter. I'm trying to think of what else I like on the mix bus. Yeah, Ozone has a lot of stuff in it. I really like the Ozone imager as well. So it's like if I'm using the Ozone limiter, I'll sometimes have some of the imager on there as well. But yeah, I'm usually kind of like, I like to have an EQ before my mix bus compressor, and then another EQ after. I've been using, believe it or not, I've been using the Fab Filter EQ a lot as well at the very end. If there's just like one really narrow frequency I want to carve out, it's like I'm loving the mix, but every time he goes to the ride cymbal, there's that one thing. And when I do it on the ride cymbal, for some reason, it doesn't work. But when I automate it on the master bus, it's like, oh, there it is. So the way everything's kind of adding up and coming out the speakers is different than what's happening on the ride cymbal. So yeah, I've a lot of my later, let's say in the last like couple of years, have had probably the Fab Filter. And when you open it up, it's like a super narrow, just little like 2 or 3 dB notch out of whatever frequency is annoying.